Well, it's great to see you today. As I was getting ready for church this morning, on the morning news, there was some coverage about this revival that is taking place at Asbury College. And it was interesting to see this room filled with students who were praying. And after showing some footage inside the church, in this prayer meeting that has now been going on for weeks unbroken, they were interviewing a couple of the people involved in those revival meetings. And they were talking about how revival had visited that campus on 2 other occasions in the past, how student bodies would go and look at some of the pictures of those revival meetings and almost say, I wish we had been there when those amazing things happened. But then they also asked them, why do you think this is happening? And why do you think that it is happening now? One of the students gave an interesting explanation. I thought that they would cite the various moral evils that we see in our society, the many reasons why we are at times as believers brought to despair. But the answer was a little different than that. After all of the isolation coming out of COVID, such loneliness and despair had gripped even our college in a place of faith, and we just needed to be with Jesus and to be with each other. And that really hit me in the heart, to just remember what a privilege it is that we get to come here, to come together on a Sunday morning, to enter into this place with smiles and joys, not only excited to see our friends, but also anticipating another opportunity to meet with Jesus, not just alone, but also to meet with him together. You know, the last song that we sang powerfully introduced our topic. Throughout Matthew's gospel, we've seen how the Jewish leaders did everything that they could in order to discredit and silence Jesus. And today we will see that killing Jesus was not enough for them. They needed to kill the movement that he began. Having extinguished the king, they were going after his kingdom in their pursuit of total victory. Turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew 27, 62 to 66. And just to explain, if it seems odd that we're in all the Easter texts and you're new to this church, we have been going through Matthew's gospel for over 2 years, and we are in our last 3 messages in this gospel. So yes, we're a little bit out of sequence, a little bit early for the season, but we are pressing through to the end of Matthew. Starting in verse 62. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard of soldiers, go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. Now today we're going to explore 3 facets of this text. First, we're going to look at the request of some of the Sanhedrin members, the Jewish ruling council members, to Pontius Pilate. We will consider what the request was, but also when it was made, and the answer isn't as simple as it seems. Second, we're going to consider Pilate's response, which has 2 different possibilities, but 1 simple point. And third, we will explore 3 obstacles that were erected to keep Jesus in the tomb, and we'll explore the obstacles this week and watch for them next week as we celebrate, brace yourselves, Easter in February. Can never happen. If you look at the way and the seasons that the Passover falls, it can never happen in February. But at Geneseo Free next Sunday, it's Easter. So my first point today is entitled The Sanhedrin's Request. And the first piece of the puzzle to be solved in these verses is who approaches Pilate with this request. Now our text tells us that it's the chief priests and also the Pharisees. However, an official delegation of the Sanhedrin typically included a 3rd group, as we have seen throughout this gospel, the elders. So it's likely that this is a smaller representative group. All of them were likely members of that Jewish ruling council, because it's hard to imagine that they would be acting without the Sanhedrin's knowledge and going to the governor. Now, the second key to determining what's going on here is to ask the question, what is the request? Now, the request is simple. These Jewish leaders want Pontius Pilate to secure the tomb of Jesus because they're terrified of what has come to be called the Passover plot, in which someone would steal the body of Jesus and then claim that he rose from the dead. In Justin Martyr's apologetical piece entitled Dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, written around 155 AD, Justin defends Christianity from this idea of a Passover plot. So we find that this notion that was being spread by the Jewish leaders had some staying power persisting into the 2nd century AD. But that barely scratches the surface of history. You see, in 1965, a British Jewish author who identified as a Christian, and I know that's a loaded term these days, but I'm going to use it in that sense. He was very much liberal in his theology, and he authored a book, I'll call it a hit piece, entitled The Passover Plot. And in the book, he asserted that Jesus planned his own resuscitation. Notice, not a resurrection, but a resuscitation. That Jesus faked his death, that he survived the cross, and then he made arrangements for his disciples to come and get him out and set him free. Now, there are many sophisticated and detailed rebuttals to the Passover plot. Apologetical books filled with evidence have been written on this topic, but my favorite refutation I found in a humorous column in Christianity Today magazine. Now, they used to have a column called Eutychus and His Kin. All right, Geneseo Bible scholars, who is Eutychus? And Pastor Ryan got it wrong last night, so don't be afraid to try.
I did.
Anybody know? He thought it was Eusebius or one of the church fathers. Who was Eutychus? Bible trivia time. You remember that poor young man who fell asleep during the preaching of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts? And he fell out a window and he died, and then the apostle resurrected him from the dead? Well, this column was named after him. It's called Eutychus and His Kin. In other words, Christians, even the ones who fall asleep in church, and the rest of us. Kind of a good inclusive term for us. Now, this column first debuted in 1961, but it ran for decades, and I can remember looking forward to every installment of Eutychus and the Kin. It was written in the format of Dear Abby. So here's what Eutychus has to say. Dear Eutychus, our preacher said that on Easter that Jesus just swooned on the cross and that the disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think? Sincerely bewildered. Dear Bewildered, beat your preacher with a cat of nine tails with 39 heavy strokes. Nail him to a cross, hang him in the sun for 6 hours, run a spear through his heart, embalm him, put him in an airless tomb for 36 hours, and see what happens. Sincerely, Eutychus. Now, I have only one thing to add, and that is that I believe that Jesus spent a full 72 hours in the grave, not 36. Eutychus is good, but every once in a while, he needs the help of his kin. Now, the third piece of the puzzle is really the piece that dominated my week. When did these Sanhedrin members approach Pilate? Now, in order to answer this question, I need to do a little review from previous messages, emphasis on little. Several months ago, I presented evidence that Jesus was likely crucified on Wednesday, not Friday. I know that messes up with what we call that day, Good Friday, and everything that we've always heard, but the argument had to do with three key facts. First of all, Jesus prophesied his coming death and resurrection by saying, no sign will be given to a wicked generation except the sign of Jonah. And Jesus said that he would be in the belly of the earth as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And that requires 72 hours of burial. In fact, I realize that you can't see very much of those details on that screen, but I want you to take note of that full 72 hours. I've heard all kinds of fanciful explanations that you can count a piece of a day as a day. But it says 3 days and 3 nights. And I believe that we need to take that quite literally. Now, secondly, we had seen that the Jews count days differently than we do. We count our days from midnight to midnight, but they count their days from sunset to sunset. Now, thirdly, in taking into account John's chronology, and remember, we looked over at the Gospel of John, and we brought in some additional information. We saw that Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Passover, not the Passover. And this was very, very significant because the day of preparation for the Passover was the day when the Passover lambs were sacrificed and slaughtered. And during those hours that Jesus, the Lamb of God, was being crucified in Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem was filled with the bleating sounds of those sacrificial lambs in preparation for the Passover. Now, here's a slide that I think you'll be able to see a little bit more easily. You can see that the Last Supper, Jesus' arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and his burial all occur in a single Jewish day, in the manner in which they recorded a day. And in AD 31, this would have been Wednesday. And we see that on Thursday, just hours after Jesus' crucifixion, that the Jews would have celebrated Passover. So in a sense, the Last Supper was not a Passover. Why? Because the lamb had not yet been sacrificed. Now the next day, Friday sunset through Saturday sunset, was the regular Sabbath, and it was also during this week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it was regarded as a high Sabbath. Now Matthew tells us that the day that the Jewish leaders approached Pilate was on the day after the preparation. That would be Passover. You see, Passover was considered to be a Sabbath. However, work on this special Sabbath was permitted since it was not a Friday to Saturday Sabbath. And the Jewish leaders, if there's anything we know about them, they were highly motivated to see the tomb of Jesus secured. They would not have left it for a day and a half unsecured. They would have taken the first and earliest opportunity to do so. And I think they would have chosen the day where work was permitted. That means very early on, Jesus' tomb is secured. Now, the second point that I'd like to share is Pilate's response. Look at verse 65 again. Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go and make it as secure as you can." Now, I'm in the midst of reading a historical novel on the life of Pontius Pilate. And it's filled with tons and tons of historical facts. And one thing that I learned was that the man who helped Pilate to secure his governorship was the head of the Praetorians, and Pilate was under his command. His name was Sejanus, and we've discussed in previous weeks that this man Sejanus was a flaming anti-Semite. And Pilate was very influenced by Sejanus. So when he came and first came into Palestine or into the Holy Land, he already had a hatred for the Jews. And then in his interactions with them, that hatred began to grow. Now, if we go back in history, and we go back to we are under the leadership now in the Roman world of Tiberius Caesar. If we go back to his predecessor, Augustus Caesar, and then we go back to the dictator who set the stage for the imperial family, Julius Caesar, we find that Julius Caesar had a very close friend, one of his best friends, a Jew named Antipater. And Caesar, Julius Caesar, was actually favorably disposed towards the Jews. So this growing anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire was actually a departure from that better beginning. And early on, Tiberius was also very anti-Semitic, and he had ejected all of the Jews from Rome. However, he is beginning to learn that this man Sejanus, his right-hand man, the man who actually he was about to make a co-consul of Rome, had actually been involved in poisoning his one and only son and heir. And it is many years later that the evidence is fully presented, and Tiberius realizes the man I was about to share power with killed my son together with the boy's mother. And so there is a tectonic shift that takes place. And now we see that Pilate is a man who's highly conflicted, because on the one hand, he truly does hate the Jews. On the other hand, he realizes that the winds are changing, and the Jewish leaders benefit from this situation, because it explains why Pilate is so accommodating to their wishes. Now, one of the greatest puzzles concerning Jesus' burial is found in this verse. What kind of a guard guarded Jesus' tomb? Was it a Roman guard, or was it a Jewish guard? And the confusion is caused by a grammatical ambiguity in the original text. You see, in Greek, now I'm going to throw out some grammatical terms. Don't worry, we're going to explain them. In Greek, there are many verbs where the indicative and the imperative mood have the same morphology or form. In other words, the words look identical, but they can have a different mood, which affects the meaning. They're only distinguishable in context. Now, let me kind of make a little more sense. For example, if the phrase we find in the text, echete kustodion, is indicative, then Pilate says, you have a guard. We see that in the ESV translation that we use all the time. You have a guard. Make it as secure as you can. In other words, Pilate would be dismissing part of their request, giving them permission to secure the tomb because they needed the governor's permission to even deploy their own troops, but not willing to deploy Roman soldiers to do so. Understand, Jesus did not want to condemn Jesus. We see that in all of the Gospels, how Pilate deems Jesus to be an innocent man, and yet his hand, he felt, was forced. He is accountable for his actions, but he felt manipulated into condemning an innocent man to a horrible criminal's death on a cross. So in Pilate's heart of hearts, this is the answer he wants to give. Aren't you satisfied? I killed Jesus for you, and you're still bickering with me. You got a guard, go take it and use it. Makes a lot of sense. But you see, if that's the case, then what Pilate is saying with you have a guard is use your own. But there's another possibility. This could be the imperative. Then Pilate is saying to them, take a guard. Now this would mean that he is granting the full request, and that the guard at Jesus' tomb were not Jewish soldiers, but Roman soldiers. And maybe that doesn't seem to make a lot of difference, but I think it's an important distinction. So the grammar in the original Greek text does not answer the question for us. However, the word choice for the guard does give us a clear answer. Because the word that is used to describe this guard is custodia. Guess what word in English we get from custodia? Custodian. But you see, for the Romans, in their Latin language, the custodian was not the guy who mopped the floors in the schoolhouse. This was a Latin loan word for the person who was part of a detachment of Roman soldiers. So I believe we are safe in concluding that Jesus' tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers. And that introduces many important considerations, because we know a great deal about the Roman soldiers, the discipline that they were under, the penalties for them being negligent in their responsibilities, and I think that this all will begin to come together. Now, my third point is that in order to secure their victory against Jesus and this messianic sect that they called the Nazarenes, the Jewish leaders introduced three obstacles. Look at verse 66 again. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. Now, let's take a few minutes and consider these three obstacles that we find at the tomb of Jesus. And I want to give Dave Guzik credit for the subpoints, because I worked for hours on coming up with something of my own, then I read Guzik and I said his is better. So the first obstacle is the stone. And Guzik referred to the stone as a material obstacle. Last week, Cole shared with us about Joseph of Arimathea, about this rich man who had been a closet disciple of Jesus. Nicodemus was his friend, and the two of them, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, were beginning to become followers of Jesus, but they were doing so quietly because they were members of the Jewish ruling council, and they had a great deal to lose. Now, Cole also mentioned in last week's sermon, he told us more about the great stone that secured the tomb, how it was built atop a ramp, how it would be rolled down the ramp, and once rolled in place, only with great difficulty could that stone be moved because you would have to push it uphill. But this week, in doing some research, I uncovered a really interesting archaeological fact about the stone. You see, there are a number of these graves that are still remaining in Jerusalem, and we've observed them, they've been excavated, and what we've learned is that 98% of the stones used to secure a tomb around Jerusalem in Jesus' day were actually of this variety. It's called a corkscrew stone. You see that image on the left? Now that stone is not going to roll easily. It had to be pushed in place like a cork going into a bottle. And 98% of the graves had that corkscrew stone. There were only 5 stones that have been found that match the rolling stone that we are more familiar with. Just 2% of the gravestones recovered. So you're probably thinking, now that I've already messed with your Holy Week, that I'm about to suggest that Jesus' tomb was secured with a corkscrew stone, not the rolling stone, and that Cole got it wrong last week. But my answer is no. Sometimes the majority does not win, for the following reason. The 5 rolling stones were all found sealing the graves of royalty and nobility. They were all found to be sealing the graves of the rich and the great. And several of the Gospels specifically mention the rolling in and the rolling away of this stone. The language of the text is crystal clear that it was a rolling stone. Pun intended. Come on, people. This suggests that although his tomb may have been thrown together, as Cole suggested last week, that was a great insight that he shared, that the tomb that Jesus was buried in was likely cobbled together in a hurry because no rich man would have put his family tomb right next to where people were being crucified. But even though it may well have been pulled together, that Joseph, this wealthy man, might have called upon many servants in order to accomplish the task, what it suggests is that Jesus was put in a grave that spoke to his royalty. He was buried as the king that he was. And returning to the Passover plot, there's no quiet way to move either of these stones, whether a corkscrew or a rolling stone, and there is no way on earth to open such a grave from the inside. Now, the second obstacle is the seal. And Guzik referred to the seal as an obstacle of human authority. The seal consisted of 3 parts. First, there was a rope that would have been stretched across the stone and anchored into the wall of that cave on either side, and it would have been attached with wax. See, they're not concerned about using epoxy because it is not the bond on either side that matters. It is actually the authority that lay behind it. In fact, in that day, they would sometimes take wax, or often, and they would smear wax across all of the cracks. They would push small pebbles in so that you could easily tell whether the grave had been tampered with. But there was a third element, a signet ring imprint upon the wax bearing the crest of the human authority responsible for sealing the tomb. And in 1969, during excavations at Herodium, archaeologists discovered a signet ring bearing the Greek inscription Pilato. It is the signet ring, I believe, of Pontius Pilate. And it is very possible, if not likely, that this is what was impressed into the wax upon the stone sealing Jesus' tomb, and that we are looking at that symbol on the screen right now. I love archaeology. This stuff is just so cool. But you see, the signet was more than just a symbol, more than just a, quote, family crest. The signet was the symbol of authority, legal proclamations, contractual obligations, all of them sealed with a signet ring imprint. So Pilate's seal represents more than Pontius Pilate and his family. It represents the authority of Rome. It signifies that he was confirmed into his office by Tiberius Caesar. So back to our Passover plot for a moment. Although the seal could be quietly broken, the penalty of doing so was death. And not just any death, likely a crucifixion, because breaking the seal bearing the imprint of an officer of Rome was high treason, a capital offense. Now, the third obstacle is the guard, and Guzik referred to the guard as an obstacle of human strength. Now, the typical Roman guard for such a duty was 4 soldiers, and at any given time, 2 of them could go to sleep. Yeah, you've probably heard sermons that none of the guards would ever go to sleep. Well, if they were covering this tomb and guarding it for several days, yes, they needed to sleep. So up to 2 of them would sleep, but 2 would remain vigilant. Now, the awake guards, the one whose duty it was to remain awake, had every reason to stay alert. Because the penalty for sleeping on the job was not that you got fired. This too was punishable by death. But it was not just any death. It was referred to as the gauntlet of cudgels. And let me illustrate. Imagine that the gap in this center aisle here was just a little bit wider. And imagine that on this side, there is a row of Roman guards, and they are all facing that gap. And on the other side, there is a row of Roman guards, and they are facing their compatriots on the other side of the gap. And all of them are holding cudgels. Now, that's a word we don't use often. Anyone know what a cudgel is? Webster says it's a big hairy club. It is, well, maybe not. It's a massive club. And they are separated enough that these soldiers can swing this club with all their might and not hit the clubs on the other side. And the soldier who fell asleep on the guard, the soldier who was negligent in his responsibilities, the soldier who violated the trust of Rome, was sentenced to run between the gauntlet of cudgels. And there are historical descriptions of this. No one ever got alive to the other side. It was not only a death sentence, but it was particularly cruel. And if you were a Roman soldier and you had any degree of service time at all under your belt, doubtless you would have seen numerous soldiers sentenced to the gauntlet of cudgels. And I'm sure in that moment, what you would be saying is, I don't ever want that to be me. So it is highly doubtful that these soldiers, that 3 of them, or all 4 of them, would have been asleep. So back to our Passover plot. In order to steal Jesus' body, the disciples would have to sneak past 4 guards whose lives depended upon their vigilance. Then they had to roll a massive stone away, whether rolling stone or corkscrew stone, without making a sound, without disturbing what would have been a very light sleep on the part of the guards. And then they had to get inside, and first they had to break the seal. But breaking the seal was what? High treason against Rome. And I think this is entirely ludicrous, because what have we seen in these disciples? Are these brave men? Are these courageous men? Until they are baptized in the Holy Spirit, they are anything but that. Where are Jesus' disciples other than John? They're all in hiding. They're all afraid that they might get wrapped up into what was happening to Jesus. So in closing, let me ask 3 practical questions concerning the obstacles that perhaps keep you from fully committing to Jesus Christ. And let's look at the same obstacles. What material objects or pursuits prevent you from following Jesus fully? Think about the everyday things that can get in between you and God. I mean, the obvious ones, the big ones, are the pursuit of wealth or the pursuit of power. We see many people who get caught up into those traps. And I think a lot of times we say, but that's not me. I'm not rich. I'm not powerful. I'm never going to be. I'm off the hook. How about some everyday obstacles? How about the pursuit, the all-consuming pursuit of getting on the leaderboard of Minecraft? Or reaching level 1000 in your solitaire game? I succumbed to that one. Or getting thousands of followers on your Instagram account so that maybe someday you can be an influencer. You see, there are many ways that the material and the mundane can begin to consume our lives. And if we're honest with ourselves and say, I didn't have time to read my Bible today, I didn't have time to pray, I didn't really have any time to spend with God today because I'm so busy. Well, maybe we're too busy with the things that really don't matter. A second question: what authority figures prevent you from following Jesus fully? Now, I've shared with you some of my family's testimony. I was raised in a Roman Catholic church, and for almost 2 years, my mom had made a half-hearted commitment to Jesus. I had heard the gospel at this Bible study that she dragged me to. It was a Bible study led by some people in an evangelical free church in Comac, Long Island, and I did not want to go, but I was only 13, about to turn 14. I didn't have a lot of clout to say no to my mother, so she dragged me along, and that night I was hooked with the gospel. And 2 weeks later, my mom and dad committed to Christ at a New Year's Eve watch night service. However, we continued to split our time going to this free church where we were learning the Bible and where we were growing in faith on Sunday evenings, but then going to our old church on Sunday mornings, going to that Catholic Mass. See, my mom, for almost 2 years, only attended at night because she feared 2 authority figures in her life. And maybe you're thinking, oh, these are going to be really big. These are going to be really menacing. Well, here they were. Her dead mother and her estranged sister. Her sister who wouldn't talk to her, and her mother who had been dead for years, but she was afraid of what they would think if she went to a different church and pursued Christ's call. Can you relate to her story in any way? Are you holding back on pursuing Jesus' call because you're afraid of the disapproval of someone? Spend some time this week. Think about that question. And a third one: what strong man resists you from fully following Jesus? You know, for many of our Christian brothers and sisters globally, the strong man is truly menacing. It's some dictator, some ayatollah, some mullah who truly has the power and the determination to eradicate Christians. For many girls in the Muslim world, that menacing figure is the father or an older brother who will kill them in order to preserve the honor of the family if they dare leave Islam and pursue Jesus. For all of us, there is a strong man that is described in the Bible, the devil, who the Bible tells us is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And we are all in a battle with that particular strong man who seeks to defeat us. But you know, for most of us, I think the straw man is a lot less imposing than the dictator or the devil. It's that boss who says to you, I can make you or I can break you. Don't tell me that you can't work on Saturday nights or Sundays. Don't tell me the church is a priority in your life. Don't you realize that I have the power of the paycheck? Or maybe it's that popular kid. If he accepts you and accepts you into his popular crowd, your school days could be filled with fun. And if he rejects you, school could become a living hell. Or maybe it's some media presence. We've seen so much of that. Some media presence that will cancel us. And it means more than losing reputation. It can mean losing your livelihood as well. You see, becoming a fully devoted follower of Jesus requires overcoming everyday obstacles to our faith. So let me ask you a hard question and an even harder one. Is Jesus your pearl of great price? We studied that parable, right? The merchant who found a pearl so huge, so beautiful, so fantastic, that he sold everything else that he had in order that he might possess that pearl of great price. Would you give up everything to pursue Jesus? Here's the harder question. Or is he just one pearl on your necklace of loyalties? There is nothing harder than setting the right priorities in life. It's hard. There's always different things clamoring for our attention. Always reasons to go and say, God is first in my life, but really make him fifth or sixth. However, if you will pursue Jesus as your pearl of greatest price and have the right priorities in your life, there is nothing more rewarding. Nothing more rewarding than putting Jesus first.